In 80 CE, beneath the glare of the Colossus arena and under a sky packed with cheering citizens, a line of women was led through a trapdoor into darkness, where the city's rules no longer applied. The image is simple and brutal: a public stage above and a hidden order below. What you are about to see is not rumor or myth. It rests on court records preserved in the Capitolian archives, on letters copied into magistrates' registers, and on recent stratigraphic evidence recovered by archaeologists in the hypogium. If this unsettles you, subscribe now, because these are the kinds of inconvenient truths this channel brings to light. The arena was not merely spectacle, it was an apparatus of domination, whose masonry and paperwork worked hand in hand. The crowd could not see the corridors under the sand, but the ledger of the praetor did. When the legions returned with prisoners from the eastern provinces, captives were entered into lists, given numbers, and assigned to rituals that combined punishment and profit. Among those names was Aelia, a woman marked as a rebel. Among the victors was Lucius Varro, a gladiator whose fame and scars carried the weight of a city. What followed beneath the stones was organized by law, ritual, and catalogued in mundane administrative forms. The records, the excavations unearthed, show chains, hooks, and inscriptions that name recipients and sums paid. This episode reconstructs scene by scene how public triumph became private torment, and how one small refusal unwound a system that many insisted was ordained. Stay with us, because the documents and the bones will make you reassess what applause actually sanctioned. The arena loomed as a municipal investment and a symbol of imperial order. From the marble facades to the sand in the pits, every element was planned to teach obedience. The Capitoline ledger records makes payments for the construction of subterranean cells and an alvareum, or permit system, that authorized the transfer of prisoners between commanders and various municipal contractors. Senate minutes mention allocations for maintenance and for decorum of spectacles. A contemporary chronicler described the city as monumental yet brittle in its care for those it displayed. Archaeological layers reveal wooden beams carbon-dated to the late 1st century and post holes that match descriptions in a municipal inventory list. The smell of tar pitch, the whisper of ventilation shafts, and the metallic taste left by dust in the mouths of those who descended are details found in guest accounts and in the physical matrix of the hypogium. Scholars such as Dr. Emma Carter and the team from the University of Verona have published radiocarbon sequences that confirm continuous use of the lower corridors for decades. The evidence is both material and documental. Legal forms and purchase records appear beside personal letters that plead for release. The panorama is clear. Institutional appetite for spectacle sat next to a regulatory machine that turned human beings into entries in a ledger. When the province was pacified, the captives declared in the triumph list reached 305. Of them were women, recorded under categories that detailed origin, status, and presumed built. Transport was described in a letter from Centurion Gaius to the praetor. He wrote about overcrowded carts, the stun of road dust, and the ritual of branding before delivery. The sensory map of movement is stark. The clack of wheels, the heat of midday, the sour smell of animal skins used to shroud bodies, and the muffled sobs that no official wanted as testimony. Among those who passed through the scales of justice were artisans, mothers, and midwives, whose only offense had been association. Records name secondary figures who processed the entries: Livia, the scribe who copied manifests; Marcus, the contractor who arranged holding cells; Dr. Aurelia, who signed medical attestations; and Sextus, the foreman, who oversaw chain allocation. These people appear in the bureaucracy not as villains in a moral play, but as technicians who made cruelty routine. Their signatures and marginal notes and ledgers show the normalization of an industry where human beings were stock. Lucius Varro returned from the Eastern Wars and became the public face of victory, his body a map of healed scars and his reputation a currency. His backstory is a study in contradictions that helps explain why he was both celebrated and uneasy. Born the son of a provincial soldier, Lucius had been sold into the ludus after a youth of sparse food and harder training. He learned how to make an audience feel possession of his body, how to walk the sand to make a crowd roar, and how to negotiate for privileges with gaudy gifts and obscure favors. In the world that trained him, success meant a lucrative patronage network and an ability to exchange favors for land or freedom. Yet he retained a humility from hunger and a memory of his mother's hands smoothing his hair. Those memories made him attentive to small gestures. They also left him vulnerable to the idea that power could reclaim what it had once taken from him. As a gladiator, he was both instrument and actor, and the choice to accept rewards after the triumph was never purely personal. Within his circle were friends and enablers named Decimus, his trainer, Cassia, a market vendor who slipped messages, and Publius, a merchant who bought favors. His psychology was shaped by ritual privilege and by the silent calculus of a man who knew that refusal might destroy his precarious standing. Early conversations in the ludus with his lanista provide texture to his inner life. Dialogue seen between Lucius and his trainer about the reward exchange. 8 exchanges. Lucius, I served, I bled, I want what was promised. Decimus, you earned it, yet promises come with conditions. Lucius, what conditions? Do you mean public spectacle, private duties? Decimus, the magistrate named sums and the patron named faces. Lucius, faces, what are you suggesting? Decimus, that some rewards are more public than private, that some are accounted for in ledgers, Lucius. If they ask me to name them, I will not lie. Decimus, they will not ask. They will tell you what to take, and you will take it. And if I refuse? Decimus, refusal costs you friends, coins, and perhaps a place on the roster. The public spectacle was engineered like a script. The arena stank of sweat, oil, and tannin. The soundscape mixed the grit of footsteps, the murmur of children, and the sudden intake of breath when a figure was revealed. Merchants called out the odds, while the herald read the municipal scroll, naming the captives who had been allotted as part of triumphal rewards. The ostentation of presentation masked the legal process that authorized transfers. The magistrate's clerk read entries from a list, and the crowd interpreted each name as currency. Among those present, Senator Titus Flavius sat with a face schooled to appear concerned. Governor Septimius Varro observed economic implications, and a small group of women from the upper tier clutched embroidered handkerchiefs as if the ritual were a play and not an inventory. The sensory detail of that afternoon included the sharp glare of sunlight on polished bronze, the dust that turned voices hoarse, the bitter scent of oil, and the sudden hush when a captive was brought forward. Aelia was singled out as a provincial leader, her wrists bound in a way that made no secret of her status. The officiating script called for a transfer of custody, a public confirmation, and a ceremonial bestowal. It was at that moment, in full view of the macro-scale performance, that Aelia made a small act of defiance. She refused to be read as property. Audience reaction named individuals and institutions. A merchant named Publius, the same man who later bought favors, shouted approval. A nurse named Flavia turned away in shame, and a child in the crowd reached for her mother's hand. The announcer read from the ledger the official phrase that turned person into asset, which the scribe Livia copied faithfully into the municipal roll. The spectacle closed, but the real transaction took place under the sand, in rooms designated for transfer and assessment. The public show was the front door. The private corridors were where consequences were enforced. The subworld where the captives were taken was a place of dim lamps, damp masonry, and the constant drip of water. Termed the hypogium in the municipal files, the area contained small cells, an inventory of shackles, and a table where assessments were made. An inventory list names items such as small manacles, a linen sheet, and a medical form that Dr. Aurelia filled. The inventory also recorded a line item called Special Assignment, and next to it, a scribbled sum. Inside that room, Lucius and Aelia met in a scene that is central to our reconstruction. The encounter is delicate to describe because it involves coercion, humiliation, and an institutional framing that turned people into evidence. The dialogue below avoids explicit detail while preserving the moral weight of the exchange. Dialogue seen between Lucius and Aelia in the hypogium 8 exchanges, with sensory description. Lucius: the air here tastes of iron and damp stone. Aelia: the light bites my eyes, but I remember sunlight. Lucius: they told me you would accept the gift. Aelia: they told them anything to make coins and keep order. Lucius: I hear the ledger speak of sums, names, and assigned dates. Aelia: sums do not buy sleep or erase the sound of my children's laughter. Lucius: I am a man who learned to obey to survive. What would you have me do? Aelia: walk out with me. Pretend you do not own me. Refuse, as a small theft from their system. Lucius: if I refuse, I endanger the favors I traded. How would you run with a man at war with his backers? Aelia: then refuse for me, for your own memory. Let one public man be private in conscience. Lucius: I do not know which is braver, the act or the apology after. Aelia: bravery is choosing the side of the one who has no ledger line. The room smelled of oil and stale bread. The scrape of a metal ring against stone made rhythms that matched the pulse in both their throats. Lucius had to choose between acting as an instrument of a bureaucratic ritual or becoming a source of scandal. The choice was small and enormous at the same time, and it exposed the seams where law met custom and cruelty became commodified. In the ledger, an entry was later crossed out in a scrawl attributed to a clerk who wrote simply, "refused entry," and wrote a marginal note, quote, "unusual circumstance," unquote. That marginalia triggered a cascade of reports. When the refusal became known, officials gathered to manage the fallout. A hearing in the Curia became the site of political theater. Senator Titus Flavius argued that public order required strict adherence to precedent, while Magistrate Claudius countered that the law had never envisaged private abuses under the guise of ritual. The debate was procedural, bitter, and oddly bureaucratic. It invoked statutes, lists, and obligations. Centurion Gaius testified about chain of command, Decimus about lodgings, and Dr. Aurelia about the records she was required to sign. At least 6 voices shaped the outcome. There were speeches, some conciliatory, some inciting, and one formal motion to investigate was filed. The result was ambiguous. A regulation was issued clarifying that transfers must be recorded in triplicate and subject to a local oversight commission. The law purported to tighten control, but enforcement mechanisms were thin. The same ledger machinery that enabled abuse was retained, and the list of sanctioned actors remained largely intact. Records in the Curia showed the Bate transcripts and a formal register of complaints that would be used by later reformers. Archaeology tied to the registers made the private machinery undeniable. Excavations led by Dr. Emma Carter and field director Marco Petronius exposed a cluster of cells with iron fittings and a small pile of personal objects. Among the finds were a fragment of a textile with a dyed pattern consistent with provincial weaving, a small wooden token with a scratched name, and a sealed jar with residue analyzed by a forensic lab confirming the presence of plant oils used in cosmetics of the period. Conservators at the Municipal Museum cataloged the objects, and radiocarbon testing placed them squarely in the era of the inscriptions. The physical evidence echoed the marginalia in the ledger. A forensic report matched tool marks on the chains to smithwork recorded in municipal expense lists. These converging lines make a case that the apparatus of spectacle and the subterranean routines were interdependent. 1 month later, the city saw a public statement from the Priorator promising oversight and the creation of an ad hoc commission to review the treatment of captives. The statement used terms like decorum and humane procedure, but stopped short of acknowledging the systemic nature of what had happened. Local scribes noted a temporary reduction in overt transfers from commanders to private hands, as officials paused to adapt to the new scrutiny. Families of affected women began to appear in municipal offices to petition for names to be clarified on registers and in some cases to demand reclassification of status. 3 months later, the Commission delivered an interim report that acknowledged gaps in documentation, listed procedural failures, and recommended the installation of an external registry that required witnesses from multiple tiers of authority. The report named specific actors and recommended disciplinary measures for clerks whose marginalia suggested manipulation of records. Public opinion hardened. Some citizens applauded reformers, while others argued that such measures interfered with traditional spectacles and patronage networks. The debate spilled into the markets and into private homes, where conversation shifted from rumor to evidence-based claims. 6 months after the refusal trials were initiated against low-level functionaries, and a public exhibition at the municipal hall displayed some of the objects excavated from the hypogium. The exhibition included transcriptions of entries from the Capitol Ledger, photographs of the cell complex, and expert commentary from archaeologists and historians. By then, some families had received small compensatory payments. Others continued to seek the full recognition of their lost kin. The epilogue continued to ripple. Museums retained the objects and added labels that insisted on context rather than sensationalism. Dr. Emma Carter's final report argued that the episode illustrated how legal forms can cloak repetitive harm and how architecture can codify social hierarchies. The archival team, led by archivist Marco Petronius, digitized the relevant pages, making them accessible to scholars and to the public. Students and activists used the case as a teaching point about institutional accountability, and the municipal council opened a public inquiry into other entries in the ledger, older and newer. Importantly, the marginal note that had caused the chain of events became testimony in later reform debates, proving that small notations in paperwork can change political winds. The larger lesson resonated beyond the stones of one city. Systems can normalize cruelty when it is codified in routine documents, when it is supported by spectacle, and when it is wrapped in the language of tradition. The refusal by one woman and the hesitation of one gladiator pierced that mask and produced controversy, documentation, and slow policy changes. If this episode troubles you, consider what monuments you admire and what they might have concealed. Comment below with the single word that struck you most: theatrical bureaucracy or authority, and tell us why. Subscribe to keep following investigations that tie the fragments of past records to human lives, and to the ethical questions we still face about spectacle, power, and accountability. What monuments do we accept without asking who paid the price to build them and who was written out of the ledger of history?